All right, good morning. It's great to be with you this Sunday morning on November 27th. For those of you watching live and for those of you going forward, know that this is lesson number 13 in our series on Genesis. When we finish this morning, we'll be at the halfway point as we will continue our study on Genesis through the winter quarter. It's okay with you, I'm going to keep it kind of relaxed and sip a little coffee with Travis here as we go along. It's a brisk morning while we're recording this, and we are enjoying this time together. Before we jump into the text of chapter 26, let's do what Marlon Conley, my professor in college, used to talk about, the review-preview method on where we're going and what we're doing. First of all, just to catch up from the last few weeks, Isaac has married Rebekah. You remember that Abraham sent his servant back to the land of his fathers to find a wife for Isaac. And we'll talk about some of the parallels between Isaac and Abraham throughout this lesson and next week. But Isaac is almost 40 years old, when he marries Rebekah. So it's not that Isaac's a young guy by our standards anyway, but he's 40 when he and Rebekah are married, so keep that in mind. But it takes 20 years before he and Rebekah have the twins. And last week we talked about Esau and Jacob being born at after 20 years of marriage for them. So to a certain extent, you think about the promise that was given to Abraham when he's 75, that an heir would come to him, and yet he has to wait 25 years for it. In the same way, Isaac and Rebekah, in a maybe a quieter way, have to wait 20 years before they have children as well. Abraham then dies. And at this point, we know the Bible tells us that Abraham lives to be 175. So Isaac is approximately 75 when that happens, and that would make Ishmael about 87, 88. So they're both very mature men when their father dies and they bury him. And then finally, at home, this would make the boys 15-ish years old, about the time grandfather Abraham dies. So we can be pretty certain that Abraham knew Jacob and Esau. And yet what's going on? We've got a sibling rivalry that's real in every generation. But in this generation, it's fascinating because we understand that Isaac favors Esau, Rebekah favors Jacob, and it's just really not good. And this is a great lesson for why it's not good for parents to pick favorites because sibling rivalry has enough challenges on its own. And as we talked about, Isaac's going to face some of the same decisions his father did as he goes through life. So having said that, let's jump into the Word. Beginning in Genesis chapter 26, and now there was a famine in the land, besides the previous famine in Abraham's time. And Isaac went to Abimelek, the king of the Philistines, in Gerar. The Lord appeared to Isaac and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land where I tell you to live. Stay in this land for a while, and I will be with you, and I will bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give all of these lands and confirm the oath I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and will give them all these lands, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed. Because Abraham obeyed me and did everything I required of him, keeping my commandments, my decrees, and my instructions." So Isaac stayed in Gerar. Okay, so right off the bat, we've got some questions and parallels to consider. First of all, why does God tell Isaac to stay in what we would later know as Philistia, or the land of the Philistines, or specifically in this land of Gerar? Why? Well, let's think about what happened with Dad. What problems came to Abraham when he decided to go to Egypt? Well, often we tend to, and we do the same thing, we tend to work around God. We try to help God out. We try to do things that are maybe easier instead of harder when God asks us to do something more difficult. Because oftentimes the most difficult thing to do is to trust God. Abraham, is told to go to the land of Canaan. There's a famine. What happens? He decides, well, I'm going to go to Egypt. And at face value, we can say, well, he's taking care of his family. He's just making sure that things go well. And yet he gets there. He misrepresents his relationship with Sarah to Pharaoh. We later know that he does that with Abimelek, the king of the Philistines. And as a result, Pharaoh almost commits adultery with Sarah, and then feels so bad about it, he sends all these gifts back with Abraham, right? Well, among them are servants and a maidservant named Hagar. So then that sin almost seems to lead to another problem, in that when there's an opportunity for Sarah to say, hey, through my handservant, why don't you have a family? There's Hagar. Well, and again, it seems like things just follow a precipitous pattern when we make one bad decision. And oftentimes, I know in my life, sometimes it's really hard to hit the brakes and say, Lord, I've done wrong. Help me get back on the right track. We tend to try and want to fix it and oftentimes get in deeper. And I think that's what we can see for Abraham here. Now, we talked about Pharaoh. What have we heard about this guy Abimelech before? Like we talked about with Abraham. Well, the reason I laid out the dates to start in the preview is to understand the differences in timing, right? Because Abimelech is not the same guy. There's a 75-year difference, and though I can't say with 100% confidence it's not the same guy, think of the name Abimelech as a name for a Philistine king, like you would think of Pharaoh as a name for an Egyptian king. And that way it becomes a lot easier. And most scholars agree this is at least two different people, possibly the grandson of the Abimelech that engages with Abraham. So you've got Abraham's Abimelech and probably two generations before Isaac's dealing with the Abimelech he deals with. From a logistics standpoint, let's look at this, because if you look at the area where he is in Gerar, and I'm sorry this map is pretty small, we know that he finishes in this area of Beersheba. And of course, understanding that Philistia is very close. When you see Beersheba here on this map, you see it here on this map, you see where Egypt is. So you understand how close Egypt would be if they were to go to Egypt for refuge or for some way to alleviate the effects of the famine. So this is a very important thing to keep in mind, that Egypt's not that far, but yet God tells Isaac to stay put. And just pause with me a minute. How often is it that God actually speaks to someone? When you think back to what we looked at, and we look at God speaking to Isaac and telling him much what he told Abraham, that I'll make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, as the sand on the seashore. What an awesome thing. What an awesome thing for Isaac to hear the voice of God. Others will hear God's voice through prophets. We know Moses actually spoke with God face to face and had that kind of a relationship, but of all of God's servants, there just aren't many who hear a direct message from God. So I don't want to minimize how important it is to know that Isaac is being reassured by Yahweh that his promise is good and his promise is true and he will take care of him. So when we come back to thinking about this physically, he's told to stay put in Gerar, and that's where he stays. So let's press on in the chapter. So he gets to Gerar, and he tells Rebekah to do specific things. So let's read. When the men of that place asked him about his wife, this is Isaac, he said, "She is my sister," because he was afraid to say, "She is my wife." He thought the men of this place might kill me on account of Rebekah because she's beautiful. And of course, we knew this when she was chosen by the servant of Abraham. And when Isaac had been there a long time, Abimelek, king of the Philistines, looked down from a window and saw Isaac caressing his wife, Rebekah. So Abimelek summoned Isaac and said, "She's really your wife. Why did you say she is my sister?" And Isaac answered him, "Because I thought I might lose my life on account of her." Then Abimelek said, "What is this you have done? One of the men might well have slept with your wife and would have brought guilt upon us." So Abimelek gave orders to all the people, "Anyone who harms this man or his wife shall surely be put to death." Okay, so let that soak in a minute. Abimelek is rightfully upset. Once again, we see that Isaac, like his father, convinces his wife to tell Abimelek that Rebekah is his sister, and he does the same, right? And I just stopped and went, what? Why is Isaac doing this? I would think that surely he would have known, about Abraham's account. And I mean, they had 75 years together. I'm guessing they shared this moment over a fire one night and kind of chuckled about, "Yes, son, I had to do this." And I would hope that Abraham said, "I should have trusted God, but I didn't." And yet Isaac repeats the same sin. He repeats the same misrepresentation. And why? Because he's afraid. And brothers and sisters, I encourage all of us. I'm afraid sometimes. I'm afraid to let people know bad news from time to time. I'm afraid to, of what others might think in a certain situation. But I think this story reminds us that when you're afraid, oftentimes you're mostly just afraid for yourself. And you're trying to take care of yourself. And I would encourage you to learn from Abraham and Isaac that the consequences of fear can be very dramatic. And if God tells us to trust Him, I think as difficult as it is to do, because I'm not minimizing the difficulty. I understand fear myself, but the challenge is to trust in Him. Why? Because if we don't, just as we mentioned a few minutes ago, I think one sin can lead to another, and we tend to struggle with trying to fix things instead of hitting the brakes hard, being contrite, and confessing our sin. We tend to try and fix them. Maybe that's what separates David as I think about it. Because usually when he's confronted with his wrongdoing, maybe the reason he's a man after God's own heart is because he's man enough to stand up and say, God, I am wrong. Please forgive me. We don't get that from Abraham and Isaac exactly, do we? So let's not give them a hard time so much as figure out what we can learn from it. Now, here's the age-old question. You know, it's been stated in the Proverbs, Shakespeare, you know, oftentimes the sins of the father, you know, will be passed on to the son. So was that a sin of the father that's passed on and a bad tendency, or just weakness of character? That's for you to decide. The text doesn't tell us. But in any event, let's take the opportunity to learn. So Abimelech is rightfully upset, and in preparation, a lot of people are saying, you know, Abimelech's a righteous guy because, first of all, he doesn't try to take Rebekah for his harem, much like his grandfather, let's call him, would have done with Sarah, number one. And number two, when he realizes what could have happened by one of his men, he lays down the law and says, do not harm this man or his wife, do not touch them. And so in a lot of ways, you've got to respect this person who, you know, Isaac thought there were godless people here. And we'll see that here in the forthcoming text. Pressing on in verse 12, Isaac planted crops in the land and the same year reaped 100-fold. Not bad, because the Lord blessed him. The man became rich, that man Isaac, and his wealth continued to grow until he became very wealthy. He had so many flocks and herds and servants that the Philistines envied him. So all the wells of his father that his father's servants had dug in the time of his father Abraham, the Philistines stopped up, filling them with earth. Then Abimelech said to Isaac, move away from us. You have become too powerful for us. So, let's think through this scenario. Things kind of get settled with Abimelech. Everybody knows who's who now, and that Rebekah is the wife of Isaac, not his sister. They're going to leave him alone. They view Isaac as a mighty prince among them, so to speak, right? And Isaac goes to work. You know, and Isaac was a fairly wealthy heir, right? We know that from the way Abraham chops everything up, while he's alive, he gives things away to his other children and other servants, but mostly he leaves everything when he dies to Isaac. So he is a very wealthy heir, but he decides to work. And God blesses his work, and the Bible tells us that he becomes very wealthy. This is an earthly blessing, right? And for us, sometimes it's hard to segregate the difference between an earthly and a heavenly blessing, because there are plenty of times we tend to read way too much into the physical in this earth. Oftentimes, God's greatest servants do not have a lot of earthly, physical possession blessing, and yet they are absolutely blessed. Jesus has told us they're absolutely blessed. But with Isaac, he's got earthly blessing, okay? He's got possessions. But what comes with that possessions? Well, with earthly blessings also comes the envy of others. And that's where Isaac finds himself. These guys are filling up his wells. I mean, you got to take some effort to get a bunch of guys together, dig with makeshift shovels of some kind, and fill those wells. And got to be downright spiteful and mean and mad to do that, wouldn't you think? Where you really want to intend somebody harm. I mean, we're out in the desert here, where water is not easily findable. So that's what's going on. And as a result, it was time to go. And though we've given Isaac a bit of a hard time, and we talked a little bit about Abraham in the same light, at this point we know that he trusts God, that it's time to go. And we're going to take a break, and then when we come back, we'll talk about the next phases of Isaac's engagement in that part of the world and what he does with Abimelech. And we're back. As we saw, Isaac has been blessed with material possessions. Philistines don't like it. They're envious, just as people are today when people have physical blessings. Abimelech says, look, I'm sensing that things are not good between my people and yours. It's time for you to go. You're too powerful for us. And he leaves, trusting that God will take care of things. So let's jump into the text. Starting in verse 17. So Isaac moved away from there and encamped in the valley of Gerar, where he settled. Isaac reopened the wells that had been dug in the time of his father Abraham, which the Philistines had stopped up after Abraham died, and he gave them the names his father had given them. Isaac's servants dug in the valley and discovered a well of fresh water there. But the herders of Gerar quarreled with those of Isaac and said, "This water's ours." So he named the well Esek, because they disputed with him. And Esek means dispute or quarrel. Then they dug another well, but they quarreled over that one also and named it Sitnah. And Sitnah means dispute. He moved on from there and dug another well, and no one quarreled over it. And he named it Rehoboth, saying, "The Lord has given us room, and we will flourish in the land." And Rehoboth means roominess or space. Pressing on to verse 23. From there he went up to Beersheba. And that night the Lord appeared to him and said, "I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. I will bless you, and I will increase your number of descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham." Isaac built an altar there and called on the name of the Lord. There he pitched his tent, and there his servants dug a well. And if you remember back, let's go back to our map. Beersheba is here, and here on this map, is not far from Gerar. So it's not a crazy long trip, but it's a significant place, and we'll talk about that because it was significant for Abraham and for Isaac. So, meanwhile, Abimelech had come to him from Gerar with Ahutha, his personal advisor, and Philcol, the commander of his forces. Isaac asked them, "Why have you come to me, since you were hostile to me and sent me away?" What a fantastic question. So let's pause just a minute. Again, the very presence of God, he appears to Isaac. And how marvelous and how awesome this must have been for Isaac to be reassured that God is with him. Now, as we showed you on the map earlier, he's very close to Egypt, probably where he wanted to go, but because he's obeying God, God is telling him, I'm with you, okay? And even though the people around him can cause temporary things to frustrate him, like being opposed to him and kind of having animosity around him, and certainly doing the thing that we talked about, the physical thing of filling up the wells, to say, you're not welcome. Isaac doesn't take it to heart. He trusts in God and moves on. And what a great lesson for us. So many times in this life, we're going to have people that try to discourage us. Physically may do something to discourage us. And yet, if we'll trust in God, we know ultimately He will take care of us. I didn't say it was going to be easy to trust in that situation, not try and work it out on our own. But I think Isaac's given us a great example at this point in his life to trust in God. And so Abimelek asks him to leave, and so he does. And again, Isaac is prospering. So it's interesting now that Abimelek comes with his military leader and his personal advisor, and Isaac kind of steps back and says, dude, why are you here? You just sent me away. Fantastic, the response of Abimelek. They answered, we saw clearly that the Lord was with you. So we said, there ought to be a sworn agreement between us and you. Let us make a treaty with you that you will do us no harm, just as we did not harm you, but always treated you well and sent you away peacefully. Now you are blessed, and now you are blessed by the Lord. So, be Isaac. What are your options? Well, you could get all smug about it, right? And say, dude, you filled up my wells. You didn't keep people from doing that. You told me to leave. Now you want to be friends? And again, I think we learn a great lesson from Isaac. You know, when someone comes to you and is contrite and is humble and is nice, let's please respond in kind. Let's not gloat over their mistakes or your position of influence or power. Look at what Isaac does. Isaac made a feast for them, and they ate and drank. Early the next morning, the men swore on an oath to each other that they're going to be living harmoniously, right? Then Isaac sent them on their way, and then they went away how? Peacefully. That day, Isaac's servants came and told him about the well they had dug. They said, we found water. He called it Beersheba, and to this day, the town has been called Beersheba. And just as a reminder, Sheba can mean an oath or seven, or the oath of seven. And Beersheba can mean, I think it's more of a meaning around making an agreement or an oath or a pledge between at least two parties to say, we will not, we'll live peaceably, we'll live in harmony. So, Isaac's time with Abimelech is marked in some very interesting events. If you think about it, he comes to his area, they have the mix-up on Rebekah, they get that settled, Isaac grows with power. Abimelech says, wow, he's got too much power, he needs to leave. Senses the animosity in his group. So Isaac leaves, and now they're coming back to form an alliance and an agreement. Abimelech was an interesting character, and I think this chapter gives us a very, very good look at how a Christian, or God's people at any time, certainly God's followers at that time, how they should live with people who are not. They always should be willing to give deference, willing to be forgiving, willing to love people, especially outside of the kingdom. I mean, I think this is a great, great parallel for a verse we often quote in the New Testament that I'll come to as we sum up on how we should deal with people who are outside of the kingdom of God, or maybe who want in or seeking. And certainly as Christians, we should live peaceably with everyone we can. We shouldn't be at each other's throats. We shouldn't be contentious. We should live to love others and live to be kind and caring of others. I think Isaac is showing us that. So, some things to think about before we go into the last part of the scripture. Abimelech takes the time to seek Isaac out, recognizing that God was with Isaac. And so Abimelech's not dumb, and he's perceptive, and he seems to be a good ruler, even if he doesn't understand who Yahweh God is. And I think he's seeking God. Second, I would say our parallel is if you find yourself in a situation where others ask you about your relationship with God, freely share. Look for opportunities to share. Get your antenna up. Understand people's questions so that when they want to understand why you do a certain thing or why you act a certain way or why you don't retaliate. I mean, the world believes that in this whole principle of yin and yang and karma, that's not biblical. If someone gives you, a contentious perspective, you're not supposed to respond in kind. Jesus didn't. He's the creator of the world. People slapped him in the face. Did he slap them back? No. They spit in his face. Did he spit back? No. We are to be instruments of peace. And brothers and sisters, I'm preaching to myself because I know I need to get up every morning and be an instrument of peace. I like that Isaac does this for us here and shows us how not to gloat and just to be simply a good man and welcoming of someone's olive branch. And here's one maybe you didn't see. You never know how God's going to use the unrighteous to show you your unrighteousness, because it happens from time to time. And unfortunately, it's happened a lot more in my life than I would like to talk about. But I think this is a good example sometimes of saying you never know what God will do to get the attention of others for His kingdom's sake. And that is something we really need to keep in mind as we press on. So, we now shift back to the family as we set up for next week. The final verses tell us when Esau was 40 years old, he married Judith, the daughter of Beeri the Hittite, and also Basmath, daughter of Elon the Hittite. They were a source of grief to Isaac and Rebekah. I now have 3 married sons, and I can tell you one of the greatest blessings that Cindy and I enjoy is the harmony that we feel with our daughters-in-law. And we're so very thankful for the choices our sons have made and the choices that their wives made in them to be together. I can only imagine how frustrating it would be for Isaac and Rebekah to be on the other side of that with Esau. But it's going to prompt a shift in the story that we'll see next week. And they want to make sure that Jacob doesn't make the same mistake Esau did in marrying people who are unaligned. Paul tells the Corinthians to not be unequally yoked. And all we can do is read in that Judith and Basemath were likely not godly and could have led Esau in a direction that wasn't to humble himself before God. We don't know, but we can probably make that inference. Not strongly, but I think we can make that inference. In another way, we see that Isaac and Rebekah want to make sure that Jacob doesn't make that mistake, but that's for next week. For today, our takeaways. Though Abraham, Isaac, and their sons, Jacob and Esau, argue, beg, wrestle, and try to bargain with God, ultimately they are obedient. So that's a good lesson in and of itself, but oftentimes I think we get guilty over questioning God. God can handle our questions. God can handle our frustrations. But ultimately, we need to be obedient. And I think that's the lesson here. Don't feel guilty about questioning God. Just make sure in the end that you are obedient. And have someone walk along beside you, because oftentimes we think we're the only people who have seen these problems and experienced this frustration, but yet our stories usually aren't too far apart. And so I encourage you to take that action, but at the same time, ultimately, we need to be obedient. Be careful as parents and grandparents, because the sins of fathers and mothers oftentimes are revisited on sons and daughters. Was it a character statement for Isaac, or was it just that phenomena? We don't know, but we do know that bad habits can be passed down. Others will be watching, and I encourage you, as I said a minute ago, to not be surprised when God uses the unrighteous to show us our own unrighteousness. But He also compels us to be ready to have a defense for the hope that we have. I want to read these 4 verses from 1 Peter 3. Who's going to harm you if you're eager to do good? Nobody wanted to harm Isaac in that situation because he was doing good in the community. But even if you suffer for what is right, and he did, they filled up his wells and had to keep moving. But even if you suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened. And I think we see that with Isaac. He settles down, trusts in God. But in your heart, set apart Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer for the hope to everyone who asks, for the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with what? Gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. I think Isaac gives us a very practical example of this if we take time to think about it. And finally, if possible, please live at peace with all men. It's been a lot of fun sharing chapter 26 with you this week, and we look forward to talking about a couple of brothers and a little competition over a blessing and a birthright next week. So take the time to read Genesis 27 through 29 and have a very blessed week.